Hello, and for a change, welcome to the sunny countryside of Cheshire, where Bluebell BMW of Crewe have lent me none other than a BMW 1M. So first of all, I'm going to give you a walk and talk around the features of the car, and then all importantly, we're going to go for a drive and find out why this car is one of the greatest little driver's cars that I've had the fortune of driving in a very long time. So here it is, the BMW 1M Coupe. Launched in 2011 and interestingly only produced throughout 2011. For the UK right-hand drive market, only 450 were ever made, and as I shall explain once we get in the car and go for a drive, this really is somewhat of a parts bin special because a lot of the key components were taken from the E92 M3. The brakes, the diff, I even believe the wing mirrors are also from the E92. But at first glance, if you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this was just a 1 Series coupe. However, there are some subtle but distinguishing features which sets this apart from the normal car. From the rear, first and foremost, is the quad-tipped exhausts. But when you're at car level with it, you soon become aware that this has got a beautiful stance. Look at these flared arches. These are so cool. We got an adjusted ride height. We have wheels which are exclusive to the 1M Coupe. Obviously, we do have larger disc brakes, the character of which I shall talk about when we go for a drive. Also on the rear is a very subtle lip on the boot. And then at the front we have a revised air intake and splitter, which is akin to styling from the M3 of its generation. And the car as standard came with sticky Michelin Pilot Supersports, which you're going to need because this has 335 horsepower driven through the rear wheels alone. And despite the fact that it has the iconic BMW 50/50 weight distribution, there's still not much weight over those rears. We shall highlight to you the effect of that when we go for a drive in a minute. But first of all, let's talk about the engine. So despite the fact that it has borrowed quite a few parts from the E92, which was the V8 generation M3, we will find, if we pop the bonnet, or hood, depending on where in the world you're watching, you will find the N54 series 135 engine. The difference being this has been reworked to develop 335 horsepower and 369 pounds-feet of torque. On paper, it does sound like the overall car and platform is just a fettled 135i, but I assure you, this thing is incredible. So let's close this down. Despite the fact that the engine is generating ample power, there is no dome in the bonnet like you've been getting on the E92 to fit in that lump of a V8. All right, let's quickly hop inside and give you a run through, by modern day standards, the Spartan but wonderful interior of the 1M. Of course, the reason we're driving this today is because of that thing. This manual transmission is connected to a torquey, explosive engine and drivetrain, which I shall share with you shortly. Not too fussy though. We have an actual handbrake. Imagine that. The 1M also came as standard and no options to have orange stitching. So every single 1M has the orange stitch. And if we get inside a little bit more, you'll see down here is the limited edition plate, indicating that this is just one of 450 cars allocated to the UK. When the 1M launched, there were very few optional extras to tick, but one of them was to have sat-nav and infotainment, which would normally sit, if you were to option it, there's this sort of sculpted dome here with a screen inside it. This has literally been substituted with a cubby hole right here for storing whatever you should require. And of course, there is no iDrive here because there's no infotainment to interact with. So you've just got two convenient cup holders. And underneath here, we have USB and auxiliary line, and strangely, I never knew what this was, but I guess it was for your phone. Interestingly, however, despite the fact that this is an M car, there was no Alcantara on the steering wheel. What it does have, however, is the triple coloured contrast stitching that runs around the circumference of the wheel, as has become iconic on BMW M cars. And then in front, just to remind you on the instrument cluster that you're driving something special, we've got the M logo indicating that you are indeed in a thoroughbred M car. Speaking of which, I think we should probably go for a drive. Honestly, as a B-road car, the explosion of torque in this is hilarious. Sorry, you've caught me mid-flow down this tight, and I mean really tight British B road. And that's the genius of this car. But let's wind back and introduce you to what we're in. Welcome to the 2011 BMW 1M. Important that it's a 1M and not an M1, because BMW already launched the M1 back in the late 70s as a race car that became a road car, and it was a mid-engine car. I think it was actually the only mid-rear engine supercar, for me discounting the i8, that BMW ever made. Which is interesting because this is also a first for BMW, and that is that it is the first proper M car which has a turbocharger ever made. So, on that note, let's run through why I believe the BMW 1M is significant to the modern classics series. Starting off with another personal story of mine. It just so happens I also spent 3 years with a BMW 1M as well. I did 25,000 miles in my car. It was white with black wheels, and it was a car that I bought because I was interested in it, but on paper BMW did not give away how special this little car was to become, and how it would quickly find cult status amongst M car aficionados. Because on paper it kind of looks like a bit of a pumped up 135i. In a way, that's exactly what it is. This is a twin turbocharged 135i engine, the N54 to be precise, but it's pumped up to a degree that results in it generating 335 brake horsepower and 369 pounds-feet of torque. The way it delivers that, though, is a little bit like this. Honestly, it's sort of spring-loaded in its delivery. It sort of takes a deep breath, squats, and just slingshots you out of whatever corner you may be exiting or straight line you may be attacking. On paper, this thing's lying. I'm telling you, they were like, let's just play the numbers a little bit conservatively and just see what we can get away with. And then what happens is you come out of a corner and squirt. I love this thing. Wolf in sheep's clothing does not do this thing justice. And it's playful. It's so playful. Anyway, yes, 335 horsepower and basically 370 pounds-feet of torque. Feels a lot more than that when you actually apply foot to throttle. It does in fact have an overboost function, which does deliver a further 37 pounds-feet of torque when you are going on short bursts like overtaking, or you just want to have that extra slingshot effect out of the apex, which by the feel of things does have quite a dramatic effect on one's senses. It also seems to have a cable connected from my smile glands to the accelerator, and the more I press it, the more I smile. Look at that. Yeah. So cool. Anyway, back to why it's special, both to myself and the world of cars in general, simply based on its numbers alone. For the UK, they only made 450 right-hand drive examples, and the car is somewhat of a parts bin special. What I mean by that is, the guys at the M division of BMW at the time effectively fancied a bit of a project at the weekend, and so they made this Frankenstein 1 Series M Coupe, which used a lot of components from the E92. For example, this has a proper limited slip mechanical differential. None of this electronic malarkey here. That was borrowed from the 92 M3, and then they decided to take the entire rear suspension assembly from the E92 M3. They then made it wider and lower, so it is squat and it has incredible stance. And then they took the brakes from the E92 M3 as well. But the M in the application of these brakes stands for melt, like butter. Something about these brakes is probably the weakest part of the car, but we'll get onto that in a minute. Look at that. Wow, and it revs. Do you know it revs? It revs. But the way this gathers momentum. Honestly, this is how M cars should be. They're engaging, they set you alight, they make you smile. Now in terms of this thing setting you alight, because it has by convention, a relatively short wheelbase. When it does let go, it lets go very suddenly. And by suddenly, I mean, oh my God, there's the hedgerow. Which in the wet makes this thing quite the slippery affair. Now, fortunately, the wizards at M Division did recalibrate the steering rack and made it a quicker pinion. So when it does let go, you do have half a chance of catching it. But you have to be driving this car with the feel of your buttocks to know when it's about to let go. You almost correct it before it lets go, because you know when it does, you better be in advance of the opposite lock, because this thing swaps ends like you wouldn't believe. And while we're on the topic of steering, the steering in this is sublime. It's actually quite heavy. I think only because I'm so used to driving electronically assisted steering racks, which feels so hollow and so airy-fairy that you just don't have the sense of connection with the road and the drive as you do through something like this. And that's applied from every car that I've driven of the modern classics so far. Steering like this, you don't realise how important it is and how much you've missed it until you try it again. But one thing which was quite unique to the 1M was how fat the steering wheel was. Now, I remember when I spent time with my car, I always used to get behind the wheel and think it was actually a little bit too fat. But the more cars that I've spent driving lately, and the more time that I've spent, as I mentioned, behind the wheel of electronically assisted steering racks, when you grab this steering wheel, despite the fact that it's pretty chunky, it just provides you bucket loads of feel. And the interface. Now, this is a relatively low-spec car. What I mean by that is there's no sat-nav/infotainment system. In a way, this is quite true to the embodiment of this car. It's a driver-focused car, and as a result, the control switches, which are usually in place to control the infotainment system, have been subsidized by two conveniently placed cup holders. And so when you get in this, it's just you and the car. There's very little distractions. On the steering wheel, there's controls for the important stuff like the volume of your sound system, and of course the all-important M button. Now when you press that, it effectively remaps the throttle, so you do get a more sensitive throttle and the drive becomes a lot more spirited. But here's where things get really tricky, and this is the only configurable setting on the car, is the M dynamic mode in conjunction with the traction control. So essentially, unless it's pouring down with rain, the first thing you do when you get in this car is press the M button on the right hand side of the steering wheel, and then up here there is the traction control button. Now, you don't hold it down to turn it all off. You can do that, and then you really are entirely on your own. But the genius of this car is the calibration of MDM, which is M dynamic mode. With the press of that button, think of this as stability control off and traction control halfway. But the genius of the calibration is when you're really leaning on this car, particularly around sort of longer sweeping corners, you can control it and steer it on the throttle, and as it does begin to lose traction, it lets you play with it pretty much within the realms of your own talent until it picks up on the fact that you've forgotten how short the wheelbase is, you haven't applied quite enough opposite lock, and then the systems very cleverly step in. But they step in a way that's not intrusive. You just lean on it a bit more and it cuts back throttle. It's genius. And for what this car is, a very pokey, leery little short wheelbase car, it controls the leery characteristics of it incredibly well. But of course, the standout feature of this car is that down there, 6-speed manual gearbox. And it was designed with the care and attention of Picasso himself. Oh, it's just such a notchy, distinct movement between each gears. Don't take notchy as a bad word. You're very aware of each movement you're making with it, and that brings me on to, of course, the way that it feels under heel toe. Now, the pedal placement is awesome. It has just the right amount of rise from the brake pedal that when the anchors are on, the brake pedal meets with the accelerator pedal with ideal alignment, so when you're rolling over the ball of your foot to blip the accelerator for your heel toe movement, everything just lines up perfectly. However, this brings me back around to the brakes, which I mentioned melted like butter, and they really do. If you're on a swift run, I don't know what was going on with the M division of this era. Doesn't matter if it was on this car, the E92, whatever it was, the brakes were shocking. They just don't have any guts. They're fine for your average road drive, and day to day, you probably wouldn't notice or complain. But if you find yourself on a long sweeping road that you know well enough to attack with great vigor, or you're on a track day, in fact with these brakes don't bother going on a track day, your foot will hit the floor as the brake fluid boils over and you run out of any chance of stopping before the gravel pit. The same can happen when you're in the Alps, only the gravel pit is a solid wall. You don't want that to happen. So the weakest point of this car by far is the poor brakes. I don't know what was going on. I'm not sure if the cooling was terrible or the fluid just wasn't up to it. This car would be transformed with a set of AP racing brakes, new discs, new pads, new fluid for sure, braided lines, would just transform the confidence that you would have in this car to push it for any period of longevity. So when this car launched, one of the things that I really admired about it was that there weren't too many options to choose from. It was kind of like, do you want the sat-nav pack? And that was about it. The car was also only ever available in 3 colours. Valencia orange, which is like a burnt orange, sapphire black, and alpine white. This is sapphire black. I owned the alpine white, and that was kind of a nod to what this car was all about, really. Forget everything else, just get on with it and drive the thing. Now, my other criticism, and I guess this might be a personal thing, but the driving position isn't the best. It feels a little bit high, and for me, there's not enough support underneath my thighs. I'd like to have the bottom of the seat lower and the front of the seat higher, and just adopt a driving position that was a little bit more sporty and a little bit less daily. Now, there is the option to buy the motorsport bucket seats for this car and have them retrofitted. I really wanted to do that in my car, but they come as standard with white stitching, and these came as standard and you couldn't change it with orange stitching. So it would have been a pain to have had white stitching bucket seats in an orange stitched car. You could have them retro stitched, I guess, but then it becomes complicated and somewhat of a big job. So in the end, you end up just living with these seats, which probably does take the edge off the fact that the ride at times is a tad harsh. So there we have it, my love for the BMW 1M. I hope one day I can have one of these back in my garage because I love it so much. And I have very fond memories of spending personal time in mine for 25,000 miles. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of the BMW 1M? What else would you like to see on the Modern Classics series? We're just getting going. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you next time. Ciao!